This is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, we have a very special guest. His name is Awan, and he is the proprietor of an excellent blog titled The Burning Blogger of Bedlam: The Cultural, the Political, the Weird, and Things That Go Bump in the Night. I came across the blog after doing a search on Libya, and I noticed that Mr. Awan had written a free book, The Libya Conspiracy: A Definitive Guide to the Lies of the Libya Intervention and the Crime of the Century. So I did read through that and found it fascinating and invited Mr. Awan to be on the show. So we're very honored to have him as a guest on William Ramsey Investigates. So the blog again is The Burning Blogger of Bedlam, and look for the book, The Libya Conspiracy. I do think it's an important book because he details many of the aspects of the destruction of Libya and how external forces work together using a wide variety of different tools to subvert the government of Muammar Gaddafi and destroy the country. And it's still pretty much destroyed to this day. So please enjoy the show. So tonight on the show, Mr. Awan is going to talk about his book, and we're going to talk about current events as well. So we're just going to kind of first get into the basics of what happened in Libya in 2011. And I really thought his book was very thorough. So I'm really glad to have you on the show, Mr. Awan.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So if you can, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in Libya.
Yeah, well, basically, these days I describe myself as an independent blogger, I guess, independent researcher. I have some minor background in journalism, but being published in some very minor publications and stuff like that. But quite a while ago, I guess I made the decision to just give up on all of that and to just go for an independent blogging platform instead, because there'd be less restrictions and I could talk more honestly and more openly about whatever I wanted, come at it from any angle. And with Libya, basically, I remember watching what was happening in Libya primarily via mainstream news, and the whole situation just seemed wrong to me from the start. The information seemed suspect, the motivation seemed suspect. Um, and I mean, I ignored it for a long time. I didn't write anything about it until I started seeing the stories coming out of Libya maybe a year or so after Gaddafi was killed about how badly the country was doing. I mean, CNN were calling it a failed state. Um, we had a refugee crisis was just starting at that point. Um, you had, Al Qaeda battalions riding around cities in tanks, and there were killings on the streets and assassinations and all this stuff. And it just occurred to me that I should go back, do some thorough research, and look at what actually happened, why it happened, how it started, what the real motivation was, and why the country was just left alone after that. But after the point of Gaddafi being killed, a new government of sorts being installed, why the Western powers just completely turned away and didn't stay to stabilize or secure the situation. So that's really where it came from. I spent maybe about a year looking into the situation, researching every angle I could, going to any source I could to build up a really solid, strong picture, a really solid case. And then I just started putting the book together. And I decided pretty quickly that I wasn't going to try and sell the book or go through Amazon or anything like that. I would just put it up on the blog and people could download it for free and do what they wanted with it.
Well, that's great. I mean, it's a great book, but tell us a little bit about Libya before Gaddafi and when Gaddafi came into power.
Well, so Libya didn't have much of a history before Gaddafi in terms of, it's a very tribal society. It seems to have been a very simple society. They were occupied by the Italians during World War II. They were treated very badly by the Italians during World War II. There was up to around 1 million Libyans died in concentration camps. And so the Libyan, I guess the Libyan psyche has this kind of natural defensiveness against against foreign powers, and which began, I guess, with the Italians, but then it went on to the French and the Americans and the British after World War II, because they essentially wanted Libya as a colony, or as a client state, if you will. So they installed this King Idris was basically seen as a British Western vassal in Libya, who was allowing basically Western powers to have military bases in the country and to siphon off natural resources and all the usual kind of stuff.
Right.
And so in 1969, you had Gaddafi come along with a group of military officers to stage this coup to overthrow the king and to take over control of Libya. It was famously regarded as a bloodless coup. There was no fighting, there were no casualties. It was just generally regarded to have happened with the common consent of the people, generally speaking. But yeah, it's interesting when you look at that. When you look at 1969, and you had a coup that was basically very orderly, with no bloodshed and no violence, and compare it to 2011, which was a coup as well. I guess was a coup, but was the exact opposite. It was just complete chaos and bloodshed and dead bodies all over the place. Um, and you get two very different ideas of what a coup is.
Hmm.
Two very different types of coup. Um, and the coup in 1969 arguably led to a couple of decades of very solid growth and development, and economic development and social development and infrastructure building and all of this. Whereas the coup in 2011, where we're now 6 years or 7 years on, and there is nothing. I mean, there is just all these rival factions and terrorists and failing governments, and
Well, let's talk about that. What was Gaddafi's policies in trying to build the infrastructure of his country?
well, it was a very kind of. I mean, I guess you could call it socialist. He had a very, I guess he had a socialist kind of leaning. That's how he saw it. He was inspired largely by General Nasser in Egypt.
Hmm.
So the idea was of Arab nationalism, of building up a very strong, independent Arab states. Nationalize everything, all the industries. Um, Avoid, keep out foreign ownership and foreign entanglements and all of this kind of stuff, and just build up a very strong independent state. But I mean, they had some socialist principles in there, I guess, but really the idea was Arab nationalism. He was big into this Arab nationalism, and he actually spearheaded an initiative, I think, in the early 70s, where the idea was to combine Libya, Syria, Egypt, possibly, or maybe it was just Libya, Syria, Egypt, into a kind of unified Arab state. They would all be independent nations, of course, but they would have a common defense pact and a common kind of economic policy, and they would be very intertwined in that way. The initiative didn't really work. It kind of ended up collapsing. But
To what extent was Muammar Gaddafi influenced by Islam?
um, to an extent, I mean. He was a Muslim and a practicing Muslim. He was to an extent, but he wasn't. Islam wasn't a central part of the regime or the ideology. It was there as a kind of, you have some countries in the world today that are, Christian. They're not these Christian countries at the state level, but they're generally considered Christian countries. It was more along those lines. It wasn't imposed. It wasn't. There was no Sharia law. There was no. You could be happily, you could be a Christian or you could be a Sufi or whatever else. There was no. It's not like Saudi Arabia or or the kind of states that they're trying to create at the moment, where they try, where they're arming all these jihadists and Wahhabis to kind of create religious states. It was the opposite of that, really. It was a more open, tolerant kind of Islam, progressive kind of Islam, as far as I can, as best as I can tell. Um, but it was there. It was important, but it wasn't central.
Gotcha. And I mean, the level of development and wealth that was distributed to all citizens was remarkable in comparison to what it was like before he took power. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Before he took power, Libyans were in total poverty. I mean, there were there were people living in shacks and shanty towns and tents and stuff, and under the king, under the monarchy at that time, yeah, they were in complete poverty. He came along within 10 years of his administration. You know, the job, the people had jobs, people had income. People who didn't have jobs still had income. They were getting a reasonable amount of money from the state. There was a kind of welfare state there going on. Um, People were being subsidized, for for just getting married or for having children. Housing was free. Housing was considered a human right rather than a commodity. There was all these kinds of policies going on, and I think he modeled some of it on Cuba a little bit to an extent, and he was very close to Castro. I know that. So,
Okay. Do you
so
know do you know about the oil wealth of Libya? Was that the main export of the country?
yeah, I mean, a very oil-rich country, and interestingly, kind of coming towards 2011, he was talking about favoring, basically turning away from Western nations in America and Britain, etc., and favoring deals with China, Russia, and India, and those kinds of countries in terms of selling the oil. And that probably would have had something to do with the motivation from some of the Western powers
Wa-
to go in there and
Wasn't there
deal with
another
them.
wasn't there another motivation that he was thinking about creating his own currency or supporting a currency? Have you heard anything like that?
Yeah, he was. I mean, he was interested in creating an African currency backed by gold, basically. And he was also, I mean, this was also kind of part of. He had this agenda of trying to establish an African bank, an African central bank, to basically separate Africa from the African nations from the IMF and the World Bank, and to kind of have their own system going on, their own financial system, and so I mean I think he was some distance into already establishing that. They had already set up. I don't have the information to hand on, but they'd set up a central bank, I think, in Cameroon or somewhere like that, and obviously there was a headquarters in Libya, and so he was part way down that route. And what's astonishing is how little that was actually reported in mainstream media at the time, leading up to kind of 2011, because it must have been going on for some time before that. I only found out about it after the fact
Right.
by looking at some interesting sources. But there was a complete blackout on these kinds of stories and initiatives. One of the main reasons he was so heavily investing in Africa at this point was, I think, because his Arab initiatives had failed, and he kind of felt abandoned by the rest of the Arab world, and he was very frustrated with the Arab leaders and all of this, because he'd been trying to encourage this kind of Arab unity and this interconnectedness of strong Arab states, and it just wasn't happening. So I think in his frustration he just turned away from the Arab world more and focused more on Africa, because he was in that position. Obviously, Libya being in Africa, he was in that position to be in both worlds, and he decided to turn in this direction instead. I just want to say the interesting thing about this idea that he had to create these unified independent Arab states was that one of the key ideas of it was a mutual kind of defense pact, a mutual defense situation, which, when you think about what's happened in the last few years with the attack on Libya, the war in Syria, you could go back to the invasion of Iraq. That actually would have been very useful and very valid had that been in place. So that if there had been this plan, to invade Iraq, it would have been, well, we're not just invading Iraq, we're going to have to face Syria, Libya, and Egypt at the same time, because they have a mutual defense pact. It's kind of equivalent, I guess, a kind of equivalent to NATO. But
Yeah,
because it failed, obviously each country was left to their own device, to fight their own battle, and we're left to their own devices.
right. That's an excellent point because it's clearly Syria could have benefited from some support from other regional states. I mean, I think that's an excellent point. Do you know what
Yes.
his his gold reserves? Did he have substantial gold reserves?
This is my understanding. I actually don't know in terms of numbers and exact value and all that. I don't know. He did have a substantial gold reserve, yes. There seems to also be a complete mystery as to what has happened to that gold. No one seems to know. So,
Well,
I mean, take a guess.
can you talk a little
Yeah.
bit about the Obama letters?
Yeah, this was something I was quite surprised to come across this. So basically, very early in 2011, I think in February or March 2011, in the very early stages of the crisis, he wrote I think two letters at least to President Obama, basically explaining to him that what was going on in Libya was an Al Qaeda led armed uprising, and that they were fighting Al Qaeda. And he was basically just trying to explain this almost like a in a man to man kind of way, just like I think he almost thought that Obama was perhaps misreading the situation or had been misled, which is kind of, I still think to some extent Obama had been misled by his State Department under Hillary Clinton and by the French, um, into a misreading of the situation. Um, to a large extent, and so these letters, Gaddafi is saying to him, please stop what please don't go along with this. Stop what you're doing. Let's return to diplomacy and let's have dialogue. Let's talk about Al Qaeda because Al Qaeda is behind this. This is what's going on. And I don't know that there were any. I mean, I assume Obama didn't reply to any of those. I mean, I'm actually surprised that those letters actually made it into mainstream media because that was my source. I think one of them I got from a French newspaper and the other possibly from an American newspaper, though I can't remember. I can't remember which one. But
It kind
yeah,
of,
it's very.
it reminds me of Saddam Hussein kind of begging the Americans, like, we'll do what you want, whatever, how can we stop this? And the Americans really didn't listen. So I kind of saw that parallel. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Obama was misled by Hillary Clinton and her State Department. But what was the actual beginning start of his overthrow? How did that begin?
I mean, we could look at that a number of ways. We could talk about just 2011, or we could talk about a broader context going, because I mean, the reality is that they were wanting to overthrow him for a very long time. I mean, you're going back 20, 30 years, to even before Lockerbie and any of that, or when Reagan bombed Tripoli
Right,
back in the 80s and all of that, and some, Lockerbie being a false flag potentially, and there was the Berlin disco bombing, which was also pretty much revealed to have been a false flag operation too. All these things blamed on Libya to provide kind of justification for sanctions and for basically just vilification and outright demonization.
right,
When it came to 2011, see, I mean, the thing when it came to by 2011, by that point, for at least 6 or 7 years, there had been a very much a cooling off and almost like or what seemed to have been a reconciliation. Um, Gaddafi was cooperating with the US in terms of intelligence and even rendition, I believe, in terms of fighting Al Qaeda and fighting Islamist jihadists and all of this kind of stuff. And Libya was beginning to open up a bit more, and some foreign businesses were returning. So I was very surprised in 2011 that our governments took the line that they did, because we were essentially, I mean, okay, I wouldn't say we were allies, but we were certainly on better terms at that point. Um, and so, my original thought was that, okay, there's this Arab Spring going on, there's this uprising going on. They're saying Gaddafi is attacking civilians and all this kind of stuff. So maybe they're misreading the situation and they've gone in on that basis. But then the more you look into it, you just come to the conclusion that no, they weren't misreading anything. This was all kind of planned out, because you get into stuff like yeah, I mean, you've read the book, haven't you?
yes,
Yeah, so so the stuff about the social media accounts. Do you remember
right.
this? And
They,
how you had arms of the U.S. military basically setting up these scores of fake social media accounts on Twitter and what have you, and and the software being in place to create this impression of all these accounts being from inside, Libya or inside Syria, and seeming very legitimate,
right.
on the surface.
But that was the Arab Spring started in early 2011, right? So
Tunisia was supposedly overthrown.
a popular uprising. So that was the state that Libya was in prior to the overthrow in late 2011, right?
Yes, yeah.
So, so tell me how this whole overthrow of Codify progressed.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, the start point, I guess you would say, would be the protests or the so-called protests that were going on against Gaddafi. It turns out there's actually very little evidence to prove that these protests were actually going on, at least not on the scale that we were told. Um, and what really seemed to have been going on is that you had these groups of gangs of kind of criminals and jihadists and Al Qaeda people in there launching an armed rebellion, but which was being sold or spun in the West as kind of a peaceful pro-democratic uprising. I mean, I wrote in the book that there was no proof that there were any actual genuine civilian protests. I've since been corrected on that by someone who was there in Libya and who spoke to me a few months ago and said that there were some genuine, actual peaceful protests by people who were not actually trying to overthrow the regime, but were calling for change in general and calling for more freedoms and things like that. I mean, these weren't people involved in an armed uprising. These were just civilian protesters. You had the armed people and the armed groups were a different matter entirely, but they got deliberately conflated by Western media to create this false impression. It's exactly the same thing that went on in Syria, where there were genuine protests and peaceful civilian gatherings going on, but there were, simultaneously there were also these armed groups and these other factions in there who sort of came in under the guise of these protests, to be, almost to be disguised by the protests, so that it took a very long time for people to actually figure out what was going on. It probably took a very long time even for the government and the authorities in Syria to figure out what was going on, and likewise in Libya. I think the Libyan military and authorities were very slow to respond because I don't think they actually understood what was happening.
Gotcha.
I think they were as confused as anyone.
Well, there was that whole scene of Gaddafi traveling through Tripoli in his car that was published, right? I mean, that he didn't, and that was what, April, that he was going through. So
Yeah,
he didn't
yeah,
sense his inevitable fate, right? Or the fate that was going to befall him, right?
yeah. I mean, I think he misread the situation for quite a while, and that goes back as well to writing the letters to Obama. I think he misread the situation because it was a very I mean, it was very. I mean, this is what drew me to the Libya subject in general, is that it was so insidious what was done compared to like the invasion of Iraq. The invasion of Iraq, there were lies, but they were kind of very basic lies of he has these weapons and this, that, and the other, and the myth that Saddam was kind of involved with Al Qaeda and 9/11 and all of this. Whereas in Libya, it would just to go to the extent of creating these vast fake social media accounts, have all of that set up, and then filming like fake. See, I mean, so one of the other things is it's since emerged from what I've been told from a few sources is that they had somewhere set up in Qatar, okay, where they filmed stuff, and they basically had like a recreation of Tripoli in Qatar, so that they could film things and make it look like Tripoli in Libya, but it was really being filmed in Qatar, and they would have these fake scenes going on, and they would stage these kind of scenes that were supposed to depict kind of the Libyan government forces attacking civilian areas and all this kind of stuff. I mean, the extent that they went to create these deceptions, on all these levels, is just so extraordinary. It's so insidious compared to Iraq, which I think was much simpler. And maybe they felt they needed to do that because Iraq had already been exposed. They couldn't go down a similar route. They had to come up with a completely different way of operating, much more complicated and much more insidious. I mean, the social media aspect was shocking to me when I discovered it, because it had been suggested to me that these social media accounts were fake. So I started looking into it, but I didn't look. I mean, I wasn't looking at alternative media or conspiracy theory stuff. I was literally just looking for. I was looking at tech magazines and computer magazines and websites and those kinds of things, stuff that isn't political or anything like that, but it's just all the geeky stuff.
Right.
And that's where I came across this stuff. It was in a tech magazines and computer magazines and websites. they were talking about this program that the American military had created, and then I'm looking at the dates of these articles, and it's February 2011. You know, literally at the same time as the Libya thing was starting up, or just slightly before that, and you start putting the dots together, and you end up with a with a very disturbing picture of what actually happened.
Yeah, it was like a multifaceted approach to removing Godify from all different levels: social media, mass media, different elements, fake rebels,
Yes.
just an incredible different, like the whole black box of different tools were used in that overthrow. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But also, these all of these tools must have been set up long in advance, because you couldn't just come up with all of that as a response to what happened in February 2011. You'd need a lot longer than that. So this stuff was all there, kind of ready to go.
Got
I
it.
mean, I'm still not sure. I'm still not sure if the Arab Spring was artificially created or if it was a genuine thing, because it may have been a genuine thing, certainly in Tunisia where it started, and in Egypt. But then when you get to the point where all of these parts of the conspiracy were already in place and ready to go, you then have to wonder, well, did they know this was going to happen? Did they help it along? Did
Was it a
they?
program, right? Wasn't there a program that was scripted that like 6 or 7 of the Arab countries would be overthrown? It was Syria, Iraq, all those, Libya, Egypt.
Yeah, this is going back to immediately after 9/11, and there was the retired General Wesley Clark, I think, who who had been in the Pentagon at that time, and who was privy to Rumsfeld having this basically this hit list of countries that 9/11 would allow them to kind of go after. And obviously Iraq was on there, and you're right, yeah, Libya and Syria, Iran, I think, and I can't remember what the others were. There was
Gotcha.
about 7 countries.
Okay, that's the end of the first half of the show. We are here with the burning blogger of Bedlam, Mr. S. Awan, and talking about his book, The Libya Conspiracy, a definitive guide to the lies of the Libya intervention and the crime of the century, which can be found for free at the burning blogger of Bedlam.
Okay, so we're back with S. Awan talking about his book, The Libya Conspiracy, and we've just kind of been talking about how Libya was overthrown and how it might have been part of a larger agenda, and that Muammar Gaddafi really didn't see his fate.
Right. Well, the impression I come to from all the research, it really, I think it comes back significantly to the CIA, and then from there it also involves the French and the British, um, possibly the Saudis. There's always been this implication that the Saudis and the Qataris were involved, which I'm inclined to believe was the case. They had a very negative relationship with Muammar Gaddafi. The Saudis did anyway. Yeah, but the CIA, I mean, this plan to get rid of Gaddafi was there for a very long time. I mean, going back to the at the very least early 1980s under Reagan. So it was always there in the background. And my reading of what happened was that in 2011, as soon as these protests started up, and they were very small protests, they weren't very big. They saw their chance, and they said, "All right, let's go for it. This is our moment." Even though at that point in time, um, at the official level, America had a very good relationship with Gaddafi. At that point, they nevertheless decided this is the time. Let's go. So when it comes to stuff like this, I'm inclined I'm inclined to focus less on public figures and politicians like Obama and Hillary. Although I'm not saying that they're blameless, because they absolutely, Hillary especially takes a lot of blame for this. But these agendas pre-exist kind of whoever happens to be in office at any given time. So, if you have the deep state or the CIA or any of these agencies who have an agenda, that agenda lasts for a very long, it doesn't matter who's in office, that whoever's in office, and I probably include Trump on this now as well, whoever's in office will end up going along with that agenda, because it's bigger than them. It predates them. And so you have something like Libya, where they've been planning since the 80s to get rid of Gaddafi. How many administrations have come and gone in that time? Maybe two or three, and yeah, 3 or 4. There you go. And then you get to Obama, and I imagine the conversation is something like, okay, okay,
This
sure.
is an opportune moment. We've got the French on board. We've got the
Yeah,
Saudis on board. The
Yeah.
Qataris are going to support. We've got some special forces available. Let's do it, right? Something like that happens. And he
Yeah,
had to have
absolutely.
signed off on it, Obama and Hillary.
Yeah, but I mean, from reading from what I've seen, it seems to me that Obama was less involved than Hillary, and I imagine that Hillary kind of just took charge of that. Being in charge of the State Department, just took charge of that, and Obama was like, "Well, okay, this is what we're doing." Um, just to go back on something you said earlier, you said about Gaddafi having not seen this coming and all of that. The interesting thing is, Gaddafi did see it coming for a very long time. He had been extremely paranoid about being overthrown from the outside. He was paranoid about the Saudis. He was paranoid about the Americans. There had been previous assassination attempts. All of this stuff had gone on. So a lot of this that gets said about Libya being a very oppressive state and, a harsh regime and all that, a lot of this was to do with that paranoia about being overthrown from the outside. He almost felt like that they had to be on their guard constantly because of the threat. Um, and so, I'm not excusing kind of dictatorship. That's not what I'm saying. But there was some justification in being very paranoid, very very defensive about threats from the outside. But what happened was, after kind of 2003, 2004, when Gaddafi started to open up more to the West, and there was a kind of reconciliation, and he got rid of his WMDs and all this kind of stuff, I think that's when he let his guard down. I think that's when he thought, okay, we're kind of friends now. Not friends exactly, but we're kind of on good terms now. We can loosen things up now. We can. I mean, he was even letting people out of jail right up towards 2011. There were all these people who'd been in jail for a long time. There'd been rebels, there'd been jihadists, people kind of under the sway of extremism and all of that. He'd had them in jail for quite a while because he considered them to be a threat. And just a few months prior, maybe even a few weeks, I might have that wrong actually, maybe just a few weeks prior to when the uprising started, he'd actually begun releasing some of these people from jail as a gesture of kind of, okay, this is a new start, let's all get along, let's all kind of, you're forgiven for these past associations and past things. There was some kind of de-radicalization program that had gone on where they were trying to rehabilitate these people, bring them away from the kind of radicalized views and all of that kind of jihadism and stuff, and send them back into society and all of this. I mean, that was obviously a mistake with hindsight. He wasn't to know that at the time because he didn't know what the foreign kind of agencies were up to. But he had this naivety that had never been there for like 20 or 30 years when he'd been very paranoid and protective. It was only in these last 7 or 8 years that he started to open up again. One of the main reasons he did was because of his eldest son, Saif Gaddafi, was a very kind of moderating, modernizing kind of influence, and he wanted to open Libya up and go in a new direction and all this kind of, he'd been wined and dined in Europe. He'd studied at the London School of Economics in the UK. He was friends with Tony Blair. He was, I believe he was even friends with the Rothschilds, believe it or not.
Right.
Well, not friends with the Rothschild, but he'd been wined and dined by the Rothschilds and all this kind of stuff. So he was a big influence on getting his father and getting the regime to kind of start to go in a different direction. One of the saddest things that I saw during all of this was an interview that Saif Gaddafi gave to RT during this crisis, where you could just see how betrayed and upset he was, and he's basically saying, I don't understand. I thought the Americans and the Europeans were our friends now, and we were all getting along. Why is this happening? What's going on? He then, of course, goes on to the issue of we're never going to trust them again. We're never going to, that's it. We're done.
He didn't make it, did he?
No, he's alive.
Oh,
He's
he's
alive.
alive. Okay. One of those codified
In
sons
fact,
was killed, right? Isn't that right?
one of Gaddafi's sons was killed, but the eldest, the one that I'm talking about, Saif, is still alive. In fact, he had been in jail since 2011. He'd been held by one of the militias, and in 2015 he'd been sentenced to death to be executed, but it never happened. And just around 6 months ago, last year, he was quietly released from detention against the wishes of the Libyan government and with the current Libyan government and all these different factions. The faction that were holding him released him. All of the stories now coming out of Libya are that this Saif Gaddafi is being seen as the only hope to restore the country and to bring the
Interesting.
country together. I
Interesting.
mean, this is a fascinating kind of turn of events where he's, I mean, these aren't official statements because I think they're very, very cagey at this point in time about revealing his activities or where he is and all this kind of stuff, because there are still American and French forces in Libya, although that's not being covered very much, but they are still there. So there's fears about that. But it's extremely interesting because in the context as well of what's gone on in Aleppo in Syria, with Assad basically seemingly surviving this whole thing now and probably remaining in power, it would be very interesting if in Libya it ends up being a son of Gaddafi that is the one who is seen as the hope to reunify the country potentially
That's
and get
fascinating.
things back on track.
You talk about the Russian satellite data.
This was so among the various deceptions that were kind of played out in 2011 by Western governments and international media was this idea that Gaddafi's air force had been bombing residential areas in Tripoli and killing civilians that way. And this was repeated all over the world. I think it started on possibly Al Jazeera or one of the Arab channels. Then it got picked up by all the American and British and European media. And there was actually no proof of it because, and more than there being no proof of it, the Russians claim to have satellite data that was watching the entire area during that whole time, and they released satellite data that claimed to have shown that there was no Libyan air force in the air at that time. There was no bombing going on. None of it had actually happened. Now, unfortunately, the only source I have for this is RT, because no other media covered this or acknowledged it or anything else. So, I'm citing RT as the source because they're the only source. There's no way to verify that. But on the other side of the equation, the Western media didn't actually provide anything to verify their claim either. So
Interesting.
it's a question of who you want to believe. But the Russians claim to have satellite data all along.
Twitter accounts. Talk about the YouTube strategy.
Yeah, I mean the YouTube thing kind of plays into the same social media Twitter operation. So basically, you had this whole swathe of YouTube videos that came up during the crisis, showing stuff, things that were happening in Libya, showing alleged crimes of the regime, civilians being attacked and mosques being blown up and all this kind of stuff. And most of it was extremely unconvincing when you really look at it. But I then sort of discovered it through, I think, another blogger whose name, unfortunately, I can't remember. But then I spoke to some people in Libya who, via email, who seemed to confirm this, which is that there was no YouTube in Libya at this point in time.
Wow.
The YouTube was blocked in Libya. So immediately, you have to ask the question of
Well, it's just
how.
it's sophisticated propaganda campaigns by the people behind the war, just like they did in Iraq or where there were, I think there was a recent statistic that came out that said $500 million were spent on phony propaganda for the Iraq war, like a huge amount of money. So all these fake videos and stuff like that. It's probably the same thing in Libya.
Yeah, well, I mean, this also goes back to what I was saying about Qatar and kind of setting up fake locations
Right.
made to resemble the locations in Libya. So I assume that a lot of these videos were shot in Qatar on fake sets and what have you. And this is also the same thing, a couple of weeks ago around Christmas when all of this was happening in Aleppo. And I'm watching all these news reports on the BBC and on CNN and all this stuff. And on the BBC, I was watching that they were talking to people in Aleppo who they identified as activists and the white helmets and all. Do you know about the white
Yes.
helmets and all this stuff?
Uh-huh.
So they're talking to these people on the ground and they're filming via Skype, and so they're filming live. And there's all these, they're making all these claims about we're under attack right now. They're coming, the army's coming, the Russians are coming. This is our last message. You in the West have abandoned us, and we're all about to be killed, and all this stuff. And you're watching that, thinking, well, hang on a minute. You're telling us that Aleppo is under siege. You've been bombed to hell for months, and you're being bombed right now by the Russian Air Force. There's the Syrian army on the ground attacking you, blowing up buildings, all of this stuff. Okay, you apparently have been cut off from food and supply and electricity and all of this stuff. How do you have internet? How are you sending a perfect Skype call with in perfect quality live at the scene with no electricity? How is that happening? What's going on? And you've got BBC reporters sitting there. I don't know if that question even occurs to them or if they're knowingly in on this or what. I don't know what's happening. But How do you not ask that question?
I guess the kid who was supposedly taken out of the rubble. I don't remember. Did you see that story? He had like ash on his face that turned out to be fake.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Just on the white helmets, have you heard of Vanessa Beeley?
No, please tell me about that.
Yeah, so Vanessa Beeley is a British peace activist and independent journalist who I've had quite a lot of contact with. I've spoken to her a bit on my blog, and she has a blog as well. And she's been out in Aleppo fairly recently and in Syria quite a bit. And she's probably the primary source of the exposure of the white helmets for what they, for the kind of fake organization that they are, and all of this. Um, and it's really interesting how she just does not get invited on mainstream media shows. No news channels will interview her or ask her about, because you'd think, here's a British woman, she's been in Aleppo, she's in Aleppo. Why don't we speak to her, find out what's going on? But no, I mean, no one goes. I mean, she's been on RT, she's been on some alternative media and stuff like that, but no one's interested.
Interesting.
Instead they're speaking to these people who we don't even actually know who they are, and all these dodgy things going on. You've got an actual independent journalist there on the ground who's not being approached, and then you have Western media who don't have anyone on the ground in Aleppo. Literally no one. CNN had no one there. BBC had no one there, but who are reporting on it and purporting to show us what's going on in this city where they have no presence, where they have no one there.
It's
Makes
amazing.
absolutely no sense.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it makes
it's
sense. I
extraordinary.
heard about the white helmets from 21st Century Wire.
Yeah, she is a contributor to 21st Century Wire, so it might have even been some of her stuff you were reading, I imagine.
I might have just not put the name to the story,
Yeah,
so that's probably it. Well, let's get back to kind of the Libya conspiracy and talk about rebels, mercenaries, terrorists, people disguised as Arabs. Can you talk about how that kind of military assault took place on Libya?
yeah, right. Well, I mean, so basically, when you ask the question of who was actually on the ground in Libya doing the fighting against the Libyan government, there's a couple of tiers to this. So at the first level, you have kind of armed rebels who've been armed from the West. Um, this is a mixture of people. You've got some mercenaries there, but basically it's a mixture of people who are jihadists or aligned with Al Qaeda or some of these kinds of groups, or just basically criminals for hire and all this kind of stuff going on. A lot of kids got swept up in this and were basically just given weapons and told to get involved and all this kind of stuff going on. But then you go up from that. You go up one and you've got the foreign agencies on the ground. So beginning with the French, it seems pretty clear from what the information I've seen that there were French agents on the ground from literally day one. Literally the very first incident that there was in February 2011, the very first incident involving armed people attacking military locations in Libya. You probably had French agents on the ground. After that, you then start to get American and British and other and Qatari and other personnel getting involved. A lot of these were disguised as Arabs. I mean, I talked about this. The interesting thing is when you research a lot of this stuff, you don't even have to go to alternative media or so-called conspiracy sites or any of that kind of stuff. You can just go to mainstream media because they leave clues scattered all over the place, whether deliberately or otherwise. So, I mean, a lot of this stuff I was getting actually from The Guardian and from Washington Post, mainstream media, revealing that the SAS were in Libya on the ground. But that they were there kind of unofficially, at a point when we weren't officially involved at all. We hadn't even had a UN resolution or anything, but the SAS were on the ground. And they were apparently going after Gaddafi. This was all in mainstream, journalism. They were there working with the Qataris, so you had lots of Qatari agents on the ground who, because they are Arab and have that natural kind of complexion, they were able to kind of blend in and with the locals and kind of sell themselves as Libyans and all of this kind of stuff. There was some talk of British operatives, basically. I mean, British operatives basically using Qatari operatives to impersonate Libyans, and all of this was going on. There were mercenaries from all over the world there. There were people who'd come from the US. There were CIA agents on the ground. There were jihadists from Afghanistan, which is quite far away from Libya, on the ground in Libya, who'd been shipped there by the CIA. something somewhere in the area of around 1,500 or something like that of them. There were jihadists who had been involved in Iraq in fighting against US forces in Iraq, who were now shipped into Libya to fight against the Libyan state. So there's this whole mishmash of just
Whole group of
just the worst of the worst.
irregular forces, special forces from all
Yeah,
different
yeah.
governments. What do you think the total amount of irregular troops on the ground was?
Well, in terms of from Western states, probably not that many, because it wouldn't take that many, because you don't need to be there. You have all these proxy armies there already. You have all these rebel groups and what have you. So probably not that many, but there would have been instructors and there would have probably been handfuls of people scattered around Libya, kind of overseeing things and um, setting up because a lot of these people doing the fighting on the ground, the local people didn't really even have any experience of using weapons and all this stuff. A lot of these were just amateurs who went along with the riot for whatever reason. I mean, whether they were bribes or whether there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there were drugs involved as well.
Right.
So
What is
so
Captagon on that subject? What's Captagon?
yeah, so I didn't know a lot about Captagon until I started looking into it, and it's an amphetamine. It's a drug that has been quite popular in some of the Arab countries, and so the information suggests that a lot of these pills have been discovered um, in Syria, among rebels in Syria doing the fighting, um,
Yeah, I've heard that.
and yeah, and so this kind of got me because you go back to 2011. I remember there was a speech that Gaddafi made about claiming that these rebels were on drugs and and I never took that seriously at the time because it just sounded like a weird kind of thing to suggest. And I know most of the media mocked it. But then you start looking at the situation in Syria, which is very closely married to the situation in Libya. They're basically one situation, is how I've always seen it.
Sure.
And all of these drugs were being discovered among Syrian rebels and jihadists and all of this. A lot of them were discovered in kind of altered states of consciousness. Some of these really extraordinary acts of barbarity that were going on. So you had. Yeah, you must have heard about the guy who ripped the heart out of a Syrian soldier and ate
Yes.
it, or
Uh-huh. Yep.
things like that.
Do you think
You
he was
start to
on
think,
Captagon? Yeah.
yeah, you start to think, would anyone in an ordinary state of consciousness even go anywhere near doing something like that? I mean, I don't care how angry you are or how much you hate the government, or really, you're going to rip someone's internal organs out and eat it on camera, knowing that you're being filmed. I mean,
It's not unheard of.
I mean,
Hitler gave his troops methamphetamines. A lot of guys on flight missions, long-term aerial missions, are on amphetamines. So they call them pep pills, which is a nice term for it.
yeah,
But yeah, it's not unheard of.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, and I have I've written about that as well. Yeah, because books have been written on Hitler and the SS and the involvement of amphetamines there as well. So yeah, it's not necessarily a new thing,
Right.
but it's just another level to what we were saying before about how insidious all of this is and just how many levels of this conspiracy there are and how much was thrown into it.
It's
You know,
just different
um,
tiers. The strange tiers of the
yeah,
media, the military, the kind of drugs on the ground. There was racism going on in the whole fight too, right? Wasn't there kind of a lot of anger towards Africans and things like that? Do you want to talk about that?
yeah. There was Yeah, so what you had in Libya, there had been a lot of migration, a lot of, I guess, migrant workers from other African countries, from kind of sub-Saharan Africa. These are all people from very, very poor countries. So, a lot of them would come up to Libya because Libya was doing so well. Libya was so prosperous for an African nation. Um, and Gaddafi, I think, kind of encouraged a lot of this because he wanted they wanted the workers for construction projects and for all of this stuff. So I think there was somewhere certainly over 1 million black African migrant workers in Libya at that time, and I guess there was a lot of underlying racism towards them from within some parts of the community, not all of the community, but within. So, as there is in any society, I mean, America being no exception, and Britain being no exception, there's a lot of resentment towards migrants that goes on all the time. So I guess Libya was the same thing, but what happened was when the uprising started and when when the government basically started getting pushed out of certain areas, towns and cities, what happens is order is lost, and then suddenly there are no rules. So the people you hate for racial reasons, or for or you resent them because they're taking your job,
Right.
any of these things,
Right.
suddenly you can just do what you want because there's no authority there anymore. It's anarchy. So you want to start lynching these people, uh, accusing them of this, that, and the other, and this is pretty much what started to happen very quickly. You had a lot of these black African migrants were accused of being regime supporters and being in league with the regime, and they would be just strung up in the street, hung from bridges, uh, summarily executed, and all of this stuff was going on. Again, for the most part, the major Western media didn't report on this, didn't really say anything about it. The accusation then came from Western media that there were a lot of these African mercenaries. There were these black Africans in Libya were working for Gaddafi and were mercenaries. There was very little proof of this, and if you really look into it, even this many years after the fact, there remains very little proof that was actually going on. The mercenaries were actually on the other side, where the people being brought in by the CIA and by from Afghanistan and from elsewhere, the jihadists. Those were the mercenaries. On the Gaddafi side, there really is very little evidence to suggest that there were any of these African mercenaries at all, but it became a very useful excuse to justify why these killings were going on of black Africans, because
Right.
they were working for the regime
But
apparently,
there was a substantial body count, wasn't there? There were huge uh, pits dug to bury the bodies. Isn't that correct?
yeah, I mean, this has all been. I mean, some of this stuff I can't really say for certain whether it's true or not because I don't know. But there were certainly very strong accusations. Yeah, absolutely. Um, even from groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, who a lot of people consider to be pro Western agenda entities, but they're a lot of the time they're not. A lot of the time they do just report what's going on. Um, yeah, even from them. And the interesting thing is, you could really argue that Western media was kind of complicit in those killings, in as much as they propagandized against these Africans by calling them mercenaries, or by placing that suggestion out there, so that you could almost like insulate those crimes and those murders because, well, maybe they're just killing the mercenaries. But once you establish that there were no mercenaries on that side, that these are just migrant workers, then you have to ask, well, what was the media doing? Why did the media like put this claim out there and then step away from it and say, oh well, we may have been mistaken, but all these people have just been killed. There's another. I mean, interestingly, I suppose there's another area. There's another dimension to all of this, which is that if you look at the migrant crisis that we have now and the refugee crisis in Europe, you know, probably 50% or more of it, which is coming via Libya, via the Mediterranean. Libya used to be the for like a huge amount of these people, Libya used to actually be the end destination, the end point. So they would be migrating up from some poorer sub-Saharan African countries to Libya to get work in Libya, and to to be construction workers or whatever that whatever they were doing, and that was it. They
Interesting.
weren't coming. They were. I mean, some would try and get to Europe, but certainly not in huge numbers, because Libya was the end point. So you're not go. You get to Libya, that's it. You're not then crossing the sea to Europe or to Italy or wherever. Now, of course, that's all different. Now they can't stay in Libya because there's nothing in Libya. So now it's extended to the European coast and then into Europe. That's our fault. We did that. I mean, we basically did that. This is kind of why some of the kind of extreme right wing kind of nationalism that we get at the moment with this demonization of refugees and stuff annoys me so much because this this isn't happening in a vacuum. This is going back to our own
Right.
our own governments did this. I mean,
Well, we're coming to the end, so let's talk about Godify's last stand in the city of Sirte and how he was murdered.
the way, I mean, everyone's seen this footage presumably from the time of him being murdered in Sirte. He's surrounded by the mob, and they basically put him to death, and that was always presented as they happened to capture him. They found out where he was, and they executed him. The reality, of course, is that once you accept, or once you discover that there were Western agencies on the ground, including the SAS and including American agencies and French and all of this, who are most likely embedded with the rebels, that whole story changes, because this becomes more of an assassination than just more of a Western-backed assassination than just something that was happening on the ground among all these crazed people. Gaddafi's convoy, had been bombed by NATO bombers, forcing him to flee and eventually end up in this kind of sewage piping or wherever he was. And then, more than likely, what happened was these rebels were tipped off to exactly where he was from Western sources,
Mhm.
saying, "Here he is. Go get him. Do what you want." The subsequent claims have come out that the French intelligence might have been in the crowd and actually been the ones to fire the shot that killed him. I don't know if that's true, but there are very strong claims being made. There are subsequent claims being made about Hillary Clinton's involvement, about whether she gave the go-ahead for the execution. The claim is that she was in Libya at that time, I believe in Benghazi, meeting with representatives and leaders of what was being called the National Transitional Council, the
You have
the
that
de facto.
yeah, you have that picture in your book of her in Benghazi. Is that right around 2011?
So she's meeting with de facto kind of new leaders of Libya, and there is a claim from a couple of sources, and I can't verify. I don't know if this is true or not, but there is a claim that they had already come to a deal with Gaddafi at this point about him leaving the country, um, and that when he was traveling in his convoy, he was actually leaving. I mean, that was part of the whole plan,
Right.
but that she uh, gave the order for the NATO bombers to attack the convoy and for the rebels to. Well, I mean, like, one of the most disturbing things about all of that is that he appeared to have been traveling under a white flag convoy. I mean, they had white flags literally attached to their vehicles, which suggests that he was leaving. I mean,
That's what I'd heard as
uh,
well. So I
and
definitely.
and just yeah, and just the idea of attacking a white flag convoy just on its own is just extraordinary, really. I mean,
Yeah, it's incredible. It's really very ruthless, very ruthless. So, so what's happened in Libya since the death of Gaddafi in 2011? How has the country reacted to his demise and the regime's demise?
well, Libya now basically is a failed state. It's pretty much in complete chaos. Um, so the National Transitional Council, which was the authority that was put in place to replace Gaddafi, lasted for maybe about a year, maybe a year and a half. That's long gone. Um, so then in 2014, I believe Libya erupted into a second civil war, where different factions who had, previously overthrown Gaddafi were now fighting each other for control of the country.
Interesting. Who
That's
who
kind
won?
of
Who won?
Well, it's kind of unresolved. Like it's difficult. So some people, some regard it as still going on. Others say it's just kind of difficult to even describe what the situation is because there are so many different factions now in different parts of the country. There are three government. I say governments in inverted commas. I mean there are three entities that claim to be the government in Libya in different parts of the country. None of them are really able to govern effectively. There's a UN-backed government, which has been rejected by pretty much everyone in Libya at this point, and is therefore completely ineffective. Um, and there's no solution in sight. I mean, because different parts of the country are under control of different factions, including extremist factions, and you have ISIS there. ISIS took over Sirte completely. Then the Americans, I think, have gone in recently in recent months to drive ISIS out, which supposedly has been happening, but that still doesn't solve the situation. I mean, it's just complete chaos.
Well, I think maybe that is the resolution that the Western powers want, is to totally balkanize some of these states and put them into tiny little principalities that fight among each other. So, unfortunately, I think that that was part of that seven nation agenda, was to, destroy the bigger nation states and make them fight amongst each other, devolve their power.
Yeah, I think you're almost certainly correct. Um, and I suppose it's scary to consider really that's not really over yet because the seven nations on that list haven't all been dealt with yet in
True.
that way. So
Well said.
I think probably Iran is the next big issue.
Yeah, I
I
think
would
you're right.
imagine.
I think you're right. So, in kind of bringing this full circle, bringing it to an end, do you want to talk about how the events in Libya can be projected to the modern age, to Syria, or what you predict for the future of that region?
Well, in terms of predicting the future of that region, I won't even attempt it because, I mean, it's who can know? There's just so much going on. It's complete chaos.
Right.
There's no way of predicting what's going to happen. In terms of Syria, I mean, the Libya and Syria things were basically the same event, in my view. The same event using the same tactics, involving the same players, the same international orchestrators, and the pretty much identical situations on the ground. It's just that the Syria thing got played out for a lot longer. Partly because Syria is a much bigger country, and partly because the Russians were involved in Syria. So, you know, Assad kind of had support from the outside, from Russia and Iran, whereas Gaddafi was kind of on his own and didn't really have anyone backing him. With Syria, um, I mean, the war in Syria isn't over. I expect it to be over within maybe, I mean, maybe within a year. Like, I really don't see it going on for longer than a year in terms of having any lingering question about who is going to be the government in Syria or anything like that. I think it will be Assad and he will stay. And that's probably for the best. In Libya, the situation is much more difficult to talk about because you have, like as I was saying, there is still the ghost of Gaddafi in Libya. His children are still supposedly, according to a lot of sources, which again is difficult to verify, but are still trying to organize a resistance against all of these foreign-backed terrorist entities and what have you. And so it'll be interesting to see where that goes, whether they will try to do this very covertly, or whether they will come out into the open and kind of declare themselves. There was a statement put out maybe 2 weeks ago, very early in the year, but which was basically called I've forgotten what it was. I think it was called the Founding Declaration for the Liberation of Libya or something like that. And it's on my blog if anyone wants to see it. And it was basically this.
Can you restate your blog again?
Oh, it's the Burning Blogger of Bedlam at WordPress.com.
It's an excellent blog, so go check out all of his posts. And anything else that we missed that you would like to talk about?
A lot of it is basically in the book, and the book is a free download. So if you go along to the blog and look for that, most of it is there. Oh well, I mean, I write about lots of different stuff. So I've been doing a lot on Trump recently in the election. Bits and pieces on Brexit and all of that. I'm quite interested to ask you, because of where you are, what you make of this election that's just happened in America and the situation right now.
I thought Hillary was going to win. I was
Yeah,
95% sure she was going to take it, so I was surprised when Trump won. So I think that he's put around him some very intense military people, and he's
yeah,
already starting to take action. I think that the decision to come out of the TPP was good. That was an excellent decision for the country. So I like
yeah.
that. Um, but you got to see what somebody does. I really don't know if he will enact or do what he said he would do when he was campaigning. But I think that, looking example of Hillary in Libya, if she became president, I think that it would be bad for the U.S. I think that she's a warmonger, and she said some very inflammatory things about Iran and Russia that, to me, are dangerous. So, in a certain sense, I like the people around Trump with
See, this is where
reservations.
I mean, I think he was a better choice than Hillary,
Yeah,
but
I agree.
I have serious reservations though about Trump and some of the people around him. Maybe not so much Trump himself, but some of the people around him. And I mean, I've posted about this on the blog if anyone wants to check it out. But there are a number of neocons that seem to have been brought into the fold around
Interesting.
Trump, which I
Wh-
find
Which
a bit
ones?
troubling. Well, see, I have a list of them on the blog.
Okay.
And I can't remember exactly which ones. There was James Woolsey, and
See, I wasn't
you
aware
know,
that he was back. The central figures for me are, what is it, Kelly, Mattis. Those guys are all military guys. I like Pompeo as the head of the CIA. I think it was
mm,
very wise of Trump and Pence to go to the CIA and talk to them the first day. I think that that was an intelligent move by either them or their advisors because they have a lot of skills in doing different things. So for me, that
yeah.
was wise. But yeah, I have to say I like some of the things Trump has done with reservations. So we'll see what happens in the future. I don't know.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was S. Awan, whose blog is the Burning Blogger of Bedlam, where you can find the book, The Libya Conspiracy. So please go to that blog, take a look around. He has a wide variety of other different posts about a variety of subjects, and they're definitely worth reading, particularly the book, The Libya Conspiracy. Thank you. Have a good night.